The bullet grazed so close to Eleanor's cheek that she felt the heat of it before it lodged into the wooden post behind her. But she didn't flinch, didn't blink, and most certainly didn't let a single tear fall from her steel-gray eyes as she stared down the three men who had just tried to rob her father's general store in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, in the scorching summer of 1882. Her father lay on the floor behind the counter, blood pooling from a wound in his shoulder, and still Eleanor stood there with her father's rifle raised, her hands steady as stone, her jaw set in that way that had made her mother worry before the fever took her 5 years ago. The men backed out slowly, hands raised, recognizing something in this 22-year-old woman that was harder than the desert floor and twice as unforgiving. When they were gone and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the dusty street, Eleanor finally lowered the rifle and turned to her father. "I'm fine, Eleanor," he managed through gritted teeth. "Just a scratch." She knew it wasn't just a scratch, but she didn't argue. Instead, she tore strips from her petticoat with efficient movements, her face betraying nothing of the fear that coiled in her chest like a rattlesnake. She pressed the fabric to his wound, applying pressure the way Doc Holliday's brother had shown her once, and she kept her breathing even and controlled. "We need to get you to the doctor," she said, her voice level and calm. "Eleanor," her father said, looking up at her with concern in his fading blue eyes, "it's all right to be scared." "I'm not scared," she lied and helped him to his feet. The truth was that Eleanor Hartwell had learned at 17 that tears solved nothing. When her mother had died of scarlet fever, Eleanor had cried for 3 days straight until her eyes were swollen shut and her throat was raw. Her father had nearly lost the store because she couldn't function, couldn't help, couldn't do anything but sob into her pillow. The neighbors had whispered about her, pitied her, and she had hated every moment of it. When she finally emerged from her grief, she had made herself a promise. Never again would she let anyone see her break. Never again would she be that weak, helpless girl who couldn't take care of herself or the people she loved. So she had taught herself to swallow tears, to push down fear, to turn her face to stone whenever emotion threatened to crack through. For 5 years, she had kept that promise. Through her father's illness last winter, through the drought that nearly ruined them, through the loneliness that sometimes felt like it would consume her whole, she had not shed a single tear in front of another living soul. She got her father to Doc Mercer's office 3 buildings down, half carrying him through the afternoon heat that shimmered off the dirt streets. The doctor took one look at the wound and shooed her out into the waiting area, but not before she saw him reach for his instruments. She sat in the hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, and she did not cry. 2 hours later, Doc Mercer emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "He'll be fine," he said. "The bullet went clean through. He needs rest and no excitement for a few weeks." Eleanor nodded once, thanked him, and went in to collect her father. As they made their way slowly back to the store, James Hartwell looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You're the strongest person I know," he said quietly, "but sometimes I wish you'd let yourself be human." "I am human," Eleanor replied, helping him up the stairs to their living quarters above the store. "I just don't fall apart when things get difficult." What she didn't tell him was that she wanted to. She wanted to scream and cry and rage at the unfairness of it all, but she had learned that the world didn't care about feelings. It only cared about what you could do, how you could survive, and whether you were strong enough to face the next disaster that came along. In the Arizona Territory in 1882, disasters came along with alarming regularity. That night, after she had settled her father in his bed and cleaned the blood from the store floor, Eleanor stood at her window and looked out at the dark street below. Somewhere out there, those 3 men were probably drinking and laughing about how they'd gotten away. Somewhere out there, life was continuing on as if her father hadn't almost died. She pressed her palm flat against the glass and felt nothing but the coolness of it against her skin. No tears came. They never did any more. The next morning, Eleanor opened the store as usual, though her father protested from his bed. You can't run it alone, he said. Watch me, she replied, and went downstairs to face the day. The store was a modest establishment, but it carried everything a person might need: flour, sugar, coffee, tools, fabric, ammunition, and various sundries. Eleanor knew every item, every price, every supplier. She had been working alongside her father since she was 12, and there was nothing about the business she didn't understand. What she hadn't counted on was how many customers would try to take advantage of a woman running things alone. The first man who tried to shortchange her got his money thrown back in his face and was told never to return. The second man who made a lewd comment found himself staring down the barrel of the same rifle she'd used the day before. By noon, word had spread that Eleanor Hartwell was not to be trifled with, and the rest of the day proceeded smoothly. She was restocking the shelves with canned peaches when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't turn around immediately, just called out, "I'll be with you in a moment." "No hurry," a man's voice replied, deep and easy with a hint of Texas in the vowels. "I'm just looking for some tobacco if you've got it." Eleanor finished placing the last can, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned around. The man standing by the counter was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his life in the saddle. He wore dusty range clothes, a battered hat pushed back on his head revealing dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, and he had the kind of face that was more interesting than handsome, all strong lines and weathered tan. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a warm brown that seemed to actually see her rather than just look at her. "We have several types," she said, moving behind the counter with efficient steps. "What's your preference?" "Whatever you recommend," he said, and his mouth quirked up in a half-smile. "I'm new to town and don't know what's good around here yet." Eleanor pulled out 3 different pouches and set them on the counter. "These are the most popular. The first is milder, the second has a stronger taste, and the third is what most of the ranch hands prefer." He picked up each one, examined them, and then selected the third. "I'll trust your judgment. Are you Miss Hartwell?" "I am, and you are?" "Caleb Morrison. I just signed on as foreman at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north of here. Mr. Rawlings said this was the best place in town for supplies." Eleanor nodded as she calculated the price. "That'll be 15 cents. He paid, and as she counted out his change, he said, "I heard about what happened yesterday. That took real courage, standing up to those men." She looked up at him, her expression neutral. "It took a rifle and the knowledge of how to use it." "No," he said quietly. "It took courage." Not everyone has that. There was something in the way he said it, something genuine and without the usual false bravado most men affected that made Eleanor pause, but only for a moment. She placed his change on the counter and said, "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Morrison?" "Caleb," he corrected. "And no, that's all for today, but I imagine I'll be seeing you again. The ranch needs supplies regular, and Mr. Rawlings says you keep the best inventory in Tombstone." "We try," Eleanor said simply. He tipped his hat to her and left, and Eleanor went back to her work. She thought nothing more of the encounter until 3 days later when he returned, this time with a list of items the ranch needed. 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of coffee, various tools, and other sundries. It was a large order, and Eleanor spent an hour gathering everything and calculating the total. Caleb Morrison helped her carry the heavy sacks out to the wagon without being asked, his movements efficient and strong. When everything was loaded, he said, "Your father must be proud to have such a capable daughter." "My father is recovering from a gunshot wound," Eleanor replied. "Capable is a necessity, not a choice." "Still," Caleb said, leaning against the wagon. "Most women I know would have fallen apart in that situation." Eleanor felt a flicker of irritation. "Perhaps you don't know very many women, Mr. Morrison." "Caleb," he said again, and that half-smile returned, "and you're right, I don't know very many women like you." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply told him the total for his order. He paid in cash, counted out with the same efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. As he climbed up onto the wagon seat, he looked down at her and said, "I hope your father recovers quickly, Miss Hartwell." "Eleanor," she heard herself say, and immediately wondered why she had. His smile widened just a fraction. "Eleanor, then, I'll be back in a couple weeks for the next supply run." She watched him drive away, the wagon wheels kicking up dust in the hot afternoon sun, and then she went back inside. Her father was sitting in the chair by the window upstairs, looking down at the street. When she came up to check on him, he said, "That's the new foreman from the Double R." "Yes," Eleanor said, checking the bandage on his shoulder. "He placed a large order." "He seemed to take his time leaving," her father observed. He was being polite. James Hartwell smiled slightly. "If you say so, daughter." Eleanor didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, she helped her father back to bed for his afternoon rest and then returned to the store. But throughout the rest of the day, she found her thoughts drifting back to Caleb Morrison and the way he had looked at her, like she was someone worth seeing. 2 weeks passed, and Eleanor fell into a rhythm of running the store, caring for her father and managing the household. Her father was healing well, but Doc Mercer insisted he not return to work for at least another month. Eleanor didn't mind. She found she liked the independence, liked proving to herself and everyone else that she could handle anything that came her way. Caleb Morrison returned exactly 2 weeks later as promised. This time he came in the late afternoon when the store was empty. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, and she noticed he used her given name without hesitation. "Caleb," she acknowledged. "Another supply run?" "Yes, ma'am, I have a list." He handed her a piece of paper with neat, precise handwriting. As she gathered the items, he wandered around the store, looking at various goods with apparent interest. "You have a well-organized place here," he commented. "Everything's easy to find." "Efficiency is important," Eleanor said, pulling down a box of cartridges from a high shelf. "Can I help you with that?" Caleb asked, moving toward her. "I can manage," she said, but the box was heavier than she expected, and it tilted in her grip. Before she could correct it, Caleb was there, his hand steadying the box and inadvertently covering her own. "Easy," he said softly, and she looked up to find his face very close to hers, his brown eyes warm with concern. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest, something that might have been panic or might have been something else entirely. Then she stepped back, pulling her hands free, and Caleb took the box from her and set it on the counter. "Thank you," she said stiffly. "You're welcome," he replied, and there was no mockery in his voice, no suggestion that he found her stubbornness amusing or foolish. He just looked at her with that same steady, seeing expression that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She finished gathering his order and tallied the total. As he paid, he said, "There's a dance next Saturday at the church social hall. I was wondering if you might like to attend." Eleanor looked up sharply. "I don't dance." "Neither do I much," Caleb admitted. "But it might be nice to have someone to talk to. I don't know many people in town yet." "I'm sure there are plenty of young women who would be happy to help you become acquainted with Tombstone society," Eleanor said, handing him his receipt. "I'm sure there are," Caleb agreed. "But I'm asking you." "Why?" The question came out more blunt than she intended. Caleb considered her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because you're interesting. Because you're strong and capable and you don't pretend to be something you're not, because I'd like to know you better." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, something that hadn't happened in years. "I have to take care of my father. Your father's healing well from what I hear. I'm sure he could spare you for one evening." "I don't think it's a good idea," Eleanor said firmly. Caleb nodded slowly. "All right. But if you change your mind, I'll be there around 7. He picked up his packages, tipped his hat, and left before she could say anything else. That night, her father brought it up over dinner. "Mary Tucker mentioned that the new foreman from the Double R asked you to the church social." Eleanor nearly choked on her stew. "News travels fast in this town." "It always has," James said mildly. "Are you going?" "No, why not?" "Because I don't have time for such things, because I have responsibilities, because I barely know the man." "All of which are poor excuses," her father said. Eleanor, when was the last time you did something for yourself? When was the last time you even smiled? I smile, Eleanor protested. No, you don't. You haven't, not really, since your mother died. You've been holding yourself together so tightly that I'm afraid one day you'll just shatter. I won't shatter, Eleanor said, her voice hard. I'm not weak. Being human isn't weak, Eleanor. Feeling things isn't weak. Your mother wouldn't have wanted this for you. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Mother isn't here to want anything. Excuse me, I need to do the inventory. She fled downstairs, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She pressed her palms flat against the counter and took deep, controlled breaths until the shaking stopped. Her father was wrong. She was fine. She was strong. She didn't need dances or socials or cowboys with kind eyes and steady hands. She didn't need anything except her work and her father and the life she had built for herself. But that night, lying in bed, she found herself thinking about Caleb Morrison. She thought about the way he had helped her without making her feel helpless, the way he had asked her to the dance as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the way he looked at her like she mattered. And deep down, in a place she rarely let herself acknowledge, she felt a loneliness so profound it was almost physical. Saturday came, and Eleanor told herself she wasn't thinking about the dance. She spent the day working in the store, helping her father practice walking with his cane and preparing dinner. But as evening approached, she found herself going to her wardrobe and looking at her dresses. She had 3 good ones. The black one she'd worn to her mother's funeral, a practical brown one for church, and a blue one her mother had made her years ago that she'd only worn once. She pulled out the blue dress and held it up to herself in the small mirror. It was outdated by Eastern standards, she supposed, but it was still pretty, with small white flowers embroidered around the neckline and cuffs. Her mother had spent weeks on that embroidery, working by lamplight after the store closed. You should wear it, her father's voice came from the doorway. Eleanor turned to find him leaning on his cane, a gentle smile on his face. I'm not going, she said. Why not? I told you, I don't have time for such things. Eleanor, the store is closed. I'm doing fine. You have nothing but time tonight. He moved into the room and sat carefully on the edge of her bed. Your mother would have loved that man. You don't even know him. I know he's hardworking. John Rawlings doesn't hire fools. I know he's respectful. He's been in the store 3 times and hasn't once treated you like you're less than capable. And I know he sees something in you worth pursuing, which means he's smart. Papa, Eleanor said, her voice catching slightly on the word. Go to the dance, Eleanor. Let yourself have one evening of being young. You've earned it. She looked at her father, at the hope in his eyes, and felt something crack in her chest. I don't know how anymore, she whispered. I don't know how to be that person. You just be yourself, James said. That's all anyone can ask. An hour later, Eleanor found herself walking toward the church social hall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She had put on the blue dress, brushed her long brown hair until it shone, and even pinned a small brooch at her throat. She felt exposed and vulnerable and utterly terrified, but she kept walking. The hall was lit up with lanterns, and she could hear music and laughter spilling out into the night. She stood outside for a long moment, gathering her courage. She could still turn back. No one would know. But then the door opened and Caleb Morrison stepped out, and his face lit up when he saw her. You came, he said, and the genuine pleasure in his voice made her throat tight. I told my father I would only stay for an hour, she said, which wasn't quite true but felt safer than admitting she'd come because she wanted to. Then I'll make it the best hour you've had in a long time, Caleb promised, offering her his arm. She hesitated for just a moment before taking it, and together they went inside. The social hall was packed with people, more than Eleanor had expected. There were ranchers and merchants, cowboys and clerks, women in their best dresses and men in clean shirts. The music was being provided by a fiddle player, a guitarist, and someone on a harmonica, and couples were already spinning across the floor in a lively reel. Caleb led her to the refreshment table and got them both glasses of lemonade. See anyone you know? He asked. Everyone, Eleanor admitted. Tombstone isn't that big. Then why do you look like you're about to face a firing squad? She glanced at him sharply, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only curiosity. I don't usually attend these things. Why not? Because I have better things to do with my time. Such as work. Responsibilities. Caleb took a sip of his lemonade, watching her over the rim of his glass. You know what I think? I'm sure you're going to tell me. I think you're scared. Eleanor stiffened. I'm not scared of anything. Everyone's scared of something, Caleb said quietly. The question is whether you let that fear control you or whether you face it head-on. I face everything head-on, Eleanor said, her voice sharp. Do you? Because to me, it looks like you're hiding. Eleanor set her glass down so hard that lemonade sloshed over the rim. You don't know anything about me. I know you're the bravest person I've met, Caleb said. You stood up to armed men to protect your father. You've been running that store single-handedly for weeks. You do everything that needs doing without complaint. But I also know that you don't let anyone close. You don't let anyone see what you're really feeling. And I think that takes more effort than all the other things combined. Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. No one had ever seen through her so clearly, so completely. It was terrifying and infuriating and somehow also a relief. Why do you care? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I think you're worth caring about, Caleb said simply. Dance with me. I told you I don't dance. I remember. I also remember you saying you don't have time for such things, and yet here you are. So dance with me, Eleanor. Just once. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to walk away, to go back to her safe, controlled life where no one could hurt her. But something in Caleb's eyes, something warm and patient and utterly genuine, made her take his offered hand. He led her onto the floor just as the band started a waltz, something slower and easier than the reel had been. Caleb placed one hand at her waist and took her other hand in his, and Eleanor felt a jolt of awareness at the contact. He was warm and solid, and he held her like she was something precious. I'm going to step on your feet, she warned. I've been stepped on by horses, Caleb said. I think I can handle it. They began to move, and Eleanor was stiff at first, counting steps in her head, trying to remember what her mother had taught her years ago. But Caleb was patient, guiding her gently, and gradually she began to relax. She stopped thinking and just let herself feel the music, the movement, the warmth of his hand at her waist. See, Caleb murmured, you're a natural. I wouldn't go that far, Eleanor said, but she felt a small smile tug at her lips. There it is, Caleb said softly. What? Your smile. I was beginning to think it was a myth. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks again, but this time it wasn't entirely unpleasant. You're very persistent, Mr. Morrison. Caleb, he corrected for what seemed like the 100th time. And yes, I am, especially when something's important. Is this important? You're important, he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Eleanor's chest ache. They danced through 2 more songs, and Eleanor found herself relaxing more with each step. Caleb told her about his life, how he'd grown up on a ranch in Texas, learned everything there was to know about cattle and horses, and eventually decided to seek his fortune in the Arizona territory. He talked about his family, his 3 sisters who had all married and settled down, his parents who still ran the family ranch. What about you? He asked. What was your life like before your mother passed? Eleanor felt the familiar wall start to rise, the instinct to deflect and distance. But Caleb's eyes were so kind, so genuinely interested that she found herself answering honestly. Different, lighter somehow. My mother had a way of finding joy in small things, a good sunrise, fresh bread, a joke my father told badly. She made everything feel possible. You miss her. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. Every day, but missing her doesn't change anything. Life goes on whether we're ready or not. That's true, Caleb agreed, but that doesn't mean we have to go through it alone. Eleanor looked up at him, and for a moment, she wanted desperately to believe him. To believe that she could let someone in, that she could share her burdens, that she didn't have to be strong every single moment of every single day. But the fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, whispering that opening up meant getting hurt and she'd been hurt enough for one lifetime. The song ended and Eleanor stepped back. "I should go. My father will be wondering where I am." "It's only been an hour," Caleb said. "That's what I promised him." "Eleanor, wait." Caleb caught her hand gently. "Can I see you again? Not at the store, I mean. Just, can I call on you?" Eleanor felt panic flutter in her chest. This was moving too fast. She wasn't ready. She might never be ready. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I'm not." She struggled to find the words. "I'm not like other women. I don't know how to be soft or sweet or any of the things men want." "I don't want you to be anything other than what you are," Caleb said. "I just want to spend time with you, talk to you. Get to know you better." "Is that so terrible?" When he put it like that, it did sound reasonable. But Eleanor knew that spending time together led to caring, and caring led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to pain. She'd learned that lesson well. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Caleb nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "All right, but Eleanor, whatever you're afraid of, whatever happened to make you build these walls, I want you to know that not everyone leaves. Some people stay." She pulled her hand free and left before she could let herself believe him. The walk home was short, but Eleanor felt like she'd traveled 1,000 miles. Her mind was spinning, her carefully constructed controls slipping. When she got back to the apartment, her father was waiting up, reading by lamplight. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," Eleanor said. "Just fine. He wants to call on me." James set down his book. "And what did you say?" "That I needed to think about it." Eleanor sat down heavily in the chair across from him. "Papa, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can let someone in like that." "Because you're afraid of losing them," James said gently, "like you lost your mother." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, but she pushed the feeling down. "I can't go through that again. I can't be that broken person who can't function." "Oh, Eleanor." Her father leaned forward, his eyes sad. "You were 17 and you'd just lost your mother. Of course you fell apart. That's what's supposed to happen when we lose someone we love. But you took that grief and turned it into armor, and now you're so protected that nothing can get in. Not pain, but not joy either." "I'm fine the way I am." "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like you're drowning and refusing to reach for the rope someone's throwing you." "I'm not drowning," Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Caleb Morrison is a good man. He sees you, really sees you, and he's not running away. That's rare, Eleanor, that's precious. Don't throw it away because you're afraid." "What if he dies?" The question burst out of her, raw and terrified. "What if I let myself care about him and then he dies, just like Mama did? What if I lose him and I can't survive it? What if he doesn't die?" Her father countered. "What if you let yourself love him and you have 50 happy years together? What if you deny yourself that chance and spend the rest of your life alone, wondering what might have been?" Eleanor felt something break inside her, something that had been holding together with spit and willpower for 5 long years. Her eyes burned, her throat ached, and for the first time since she'd made that promise to herself, she felt tears start to well up. But she couldn't let them fall, not now, not after all this time. She stood abruptly. "I'm tired, I'm going to bed." "Eleanor. Good night, Papa." She fled to her room and closed the door, pressing her back against it as she fought for control. The tears were there, pushing at the edges of her composure, demanding release. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. She'd gone 5 years without crying in front of anyone, and she wasn't going to break now. She changed into her nightgown with shaking hands, blew out her lamp, and climbed into bed. In the darkness, alone, she felt the full weight of her loneliness settle over her like a shroud. And still, she didn't cry. The next week passed in a blur. Eleanor threw herself into work, helping her father return to his duties behind the counter even though Doc Mercer said he should rest another week. She inventoried every item in the store twice, scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, and reorganized the stockroom. Anything to keep her mind occupied, to keep her thoughts from drifting back to Caleb Morrison and the way he'd looked at her, like she was the only person in the room. He came in on Thursday, earlier than usual. Eleanor was stocking shelves when she heard the bell and her heart jumped before she could stop it. She turned to find him watching her, his hat in his hands. "Hello, Eleanor. Caleb, I wasn't expecting you for a few more days." "I know. I was in town for other business and thought I'd stop by." He moved closer, his expression serious. "Have you thought about what I asked?" Eleanor's hands tightened on the can of peaches she was holding. "I have. And I think it's best if we keep our relationship professional. You need supplies, we provide them, that's all." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, something that might have been hurt, but he nodded slowly. "Can I ask why?" "Because it's simpler this way. Because I don't have time for complications. Because—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Because you're scared," Caleb finished for her. "Eleanor, I understand that you've been hurt. I understand that you've learned to protect yourself, but you can't live your whole life behind walls." "You don't understand anything about me," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "You've known me for less than a month. You have no idea what I've been through or what I need." "You're right," Caleb said quietly. "I don't know everything about you, but I know enough to know that you're miserable. I can see it in your eyes, Eleanor. You're so busy being strong that you've forgotten how to live." "Get out," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "Get out of my store." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, his expression sad. Then he put his hat back on and walked to the door, but before he left, he turned back. "I'm not giving up on you, Eleanor. I'll give you space because you asked for it, but I'm not giving up. When you're ready to stop running, I'll be here." Then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with the canned peaches and the truth she didn't want to face. That night, she barely slept. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying every conversation she'd had with Caleb, every moment they'd shared. She thought about the way he'd steadied her when she'd nearly dropped the box, the way he'd held her while they danced, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. And she thought about how she'd pushed him away because she was too afraid to take a chance. By the time dawn broke, Eleanor had made a decision. She was going to prove to herself that she didn't need Caleb Morrison or anyone else. She was fine alone. She'd been fine for 5 years, and she'd be fine for 50 more. But as the days passed, she found that resolution harder and harder to maintain. She caught herself looking for him every time the bell over the door chimed. She found her thoughts drifting to him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking about her. And worst of all, she found herself lonely in a way she hadn't been before she met him. Before, she'd had her solitude. Now, she just felt alone. 2 weeks later, a situation arose that would change everything. It started with a commotion outside the store. Eleanor heard shouting and the sound of hooves, and she went to the window to see what was happening. A rider was galloping down the main street, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He pulled up at the sheriff's office and practically fell off his mount, shouting about an accident at the Double R Ranch. Eleanor's heart stopped. Before she knew what she was doing, she was running outside, her apron still on, her hair coming loose from its pins. She caught the rider by his arm. "What happened? What kind of accident?" The cowboy, young and clearly shaken, looked at her with wide eyes. "One of the corrals collapsed. Several men are hurt. The foreman got trapped under part of the fence." "The foreman," Eleanor repeated, her voice hollow. "Caleb Morrison?" "Yes, ma'am. They're bringing him into town now, along with the others. Doc Mercer's been sent for." Eleanor didn't remember making a conscious decision to move, but suddenly she was running toward the doctor's office. Her father called after her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The only thought in her mind was that Caleb was hurt, possibly dying, and she had wasted 2 weeks being afraid. She reached Doc Mercer's office just as a wagon pulled up. 3 men were in the back, all bloodied and groaning. Caleb was one of them, his face pale beneath the dust and blood, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack wide open. "Caleb," she gasped and climbed up into the wagon without thinking, his eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. "Eleanor." "What are you?" "Hush," she said, taking his hand. "Don't try to talk. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." Doc Mercer appeared with 2 other men, and they began carefully lifting the injured cowboys out of the wagon. When they got to Caleb, he groaned in pain, and Eleanor felt tears start to burn behind her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, helping to support his shoulders as they carried him inside and laid him on the examination table. "You need to wait outside, Miss Hartwell," Doc Mercer said gently. "No," Eleanor said. "I'm staying." "Eleanor," Caleb managed, his voice tight with pain, "you should go." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely and gripped his hand tighter. Doc Mercer looked between them and sighed. "Fine, but stay out of my way." The next hour was the longest of Eleanor's life. She watched as Doc Mercer cleaned Caleb's wounds, set his broken leg, and stitched up a deep gash on his arm. Caleb gritted his teeth through most of it, but when the doctor had to manipulate the break to set it properly, he cried out, and Eleanor felt that sound like a physical blow. "Almost done," Doc Mercer murmured. "You're doing fine, son." Finally, it was over. Caleb lay on the table, his face white and sheened with sweat, his leg splinted and bandaged. Doc Mercer washed his hands and said, "The leg will heal, but it'll take time. 6 to 8 weeks before he can put weight on it, and even then he'll need to take it easy. He's lucky it was a clean break." "Thank you, doctor," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "He'll need to stay in town for a while. He can't make that ride back to the ranch until the leg's more stable. Does he have anywhere to stay?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "He'll stay with us. We have a spare room above the store." Caleb's eyes opened. "Eleanor, I can't impose." "You're not imposing. You're recovering, and I'm not arguing about this." She looked at Doc Mercer. "When can he be moved? Give him an hour to rest, then you can take him if you're careful. I'll come by tomorrow to check on him." Eleanor nodded and pulled a chair up next to the table. She sat down and took Caleb's hand again, holding it gently. "Rest," she said softly. "I'll be here." "You don't have to do this," Caleb said, his eyes searching her face. "I know," Eleanor replied. "I want to." Caleb's eyes drifted closed, but his hand remained wrapped around hers. Eleanor sat there, watching him breathe, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She had been so afraid of losing someone that she had almost lost her chance at something beautiful. But it wasn't too late. He was alive and she was here, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. An hour later, with the help of 2 ranch hands, they carefully moved Caleb to the store. James Hartwell had prepared the spare room, and they settled Caleb into the bed with pillows propped under his injured leg. Eleanor sent the ranch hands back with a message for Mr. Rawlings that his foreman was in good hands and would return when he was healed. Then she pulled a chair up beside Caleb's bed and sat down to keep watch. "You don't have to stay," Caleb said, his voice fuzzy with the laudanum Doc Mercer had given him for the pain. "Yes, I do," Eleanor said simply. "Why?" She looked at him, at his bruised face and bandaged arm and splinted leg, and felt her heart constrict. "Because I was wrong, about everything, about you, about what I needed, about being strong. I thought if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't get hurt, but all I did was hurt myself." "Eleanor." "Let me finish," she said. "When I heard you were injured, when I thought you might die, I realized something. I realized that spending 50 years alone because I'm afraid is worse than risking my heart on someone who might leave. You were right. I've been drowning, and I've been too stubborn to reach for the rope." Caleb reached for her hand, his grip weak but determined. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor, not if I can help it." "You can't promise that," she whispered. "No one can promise that." "No," Caleb agreed. "But I can promise that every day I have, I'll choose you. I'll choose us. And if that's not enough, if you need more certainty than that, then I don't know what else to say." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, and she felt the burn of tears behind her eyes again. But this time, she didn't fight them. This time, she let one tear fall, then another and another, until she was crying for the first time in 5 years in front of another person. The tears came hot and fast, years of suppressed grief and fear and loneliness pouring out of her in great, shuddering sobs. Caleb pulled her closer with his good arm, and Eleanor buried her face in his shoulder and wept. She cried for her mother, for her lost youth, for all the years she'd spent being alone because she was too afraid to be anything else. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was empty and exhausted and somehow lighter than she'd felt in years. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were swollen and she felt mortified. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I didn't mean to." "Hey," Caleb said gently, cupping her face with his hand. "Don't apologize. Tears are safe here with me, always." Eleanor looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and felt something inside her settle. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to let someone in." "We'll figure it out together," Caleb promised. "One day at a time," and in that moment Eleanor believed him. The next few weeks were a revelation. Caleb stayed in the spare room, and Eleanor took care of him with a fierce determination that surprised them both. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, helped him with the exercises Doc Mercer prescribed, and in between the practical tasks they talked. They talked about everything and nothing. Caleb told her stories about his childhood in Texas, about learning to rope cattle and break horses, about the time he'd fallen into a creek and had to be rescued by his youngest sister. Eleanor told him about her mother, about the way she used to sing while she worked, about the flower garden she'd kept behind the store that had died when she did. "Do you still have the garden space?" Caleb asked one afternoon. Eleanor nodded. "It's overgrown now. I didn't have the heart to tend it after she passed." "Maybe we could fix it up," Caleb suggested. "When I'm back on my feet, plant some new flowers." "Maybe," Eleanor said, and the word felt like a promise. James Hartwell watched his daughter bloom like a flower after rain. She smiled more, laughed more, seemed lighter somehow. He saw the way she looked at Caleb, the way her whole face softened when she entered his room. And he saw the way Caleb looked at her, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. One evening, after Eleanor had gone down to close the store, Caleb called James into his room. "Sir, I'd like to talk to you about something." James sat down, his expression curious. "All right." "I know I'm in no position to ask this right now," Caleb said. "I'm laid up in your spare room, dependent on your daughter's charity, and we've only known each other for a couple of months. But I need you to know that my intentions toward Eleanor are completely honorable. I'm falling in love with her, and when I'm healed, when I can stand on my own 2 feet again, I intend to ask her to marry me." James smiled slowly. "I appreciate you telling me, son, but you should know that it's not my permission you need. It's hers. Eleanor's her own woman, and she makes her own choices." "I know," Caleb said, "but I wanted you to know that I'll take care of her. I'll protect her and provide for her and do everything in my power to make her happy." "What she needs isn't protection," James said. "She's been protecting herself just fine. What she needs is someone who sees her, who loves her for exactly who she is, walls and all. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said without hesitation. "I already do," James nodded, satisfied. "Then you have my blessing for what it's worth." By the time 6 weeks had passed, Caleb was able to move around on crutches, and Doc Mercer pronounced the leg healed enough for him to return to the ranch. Eleanor helped him pack his few belongings, and neither of them spoke about what would happen next. The morning he was set to leave, Caleb came down the stairs slowly, his crutches thumping on each step. Eleanor was behind the counter, organizing the day's receipts, and she looked up when he entered. "All set?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Almost," Caleb said. He moved to the counter and set his crutches aside, balancing on his good leg. "Eleanor, I need to say something before I go. You don't have to say anything. You needed help and I helped you, that's all. That's not all, and you know it." Caleb reached across the counter and took her hand. "These past 6 weeks have been the best of my life, despite the broken leg. Because I got to spend them with you. I got to see who you really are, not just the strong, capable woman you show the world, but the soft, tender, funny, brilliant person underneath. And I've fallen completely, irreversibly in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught. "Caleb, I'm not finished," he said. "I know you're still scared. I know you're still worried about losing people, about getting hurt, but Eleanor, I'm asking you to take a chance on me, on us. I'm asking you to marry me and build a life together. I can't promise I'll never die because everyone dies eventually, but I can promise that every day we have, I'll love you with everything I am. What do you say?" Eleanor looked at him, at his earnest face and hopeful eyes, and she felt her heart swell so large she thought it might burst. For 5 years she had been afraid. For 5 years she had held herself apart from the world. But standing here with this man who had seen her at her worst and still wanted her, she found that the fear was still there, but it was manageable. Because the alternative, a life without him, was infinitely worse. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Caleb's face split into a grin so wide it looked almost painful. He leaned across the counter and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Eleanor was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "I love you," she said, and realized it was the first time she'd said those words to anyone since her mother died. "I love you too," Caleb said, "so much." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church, with James Hartwell beaming beside his daughter and half the town in attendance. Eleanor wore the blue dress with the embroidered flowers, and Caleb wore a new suit that he'd ordered special from the catalog. When the preacher asked if she took this man, Eleanor said, "I do," in a clear, strong voice that didn't waver. At the reception in the church hall, the same one where they'd danced that first night, Caleb pulled Eleanor close and said, "Are you happy?" "More than I ever thought possible," Eleanor admitted. "Good," Caleb said, "because this is just the beginning." They moved into a small house on the Double R Ranch, close enough to town that Eleanor could still help her father at the store but far enough that they had their own space. Caleb returned to his duties as foreman, though he favored his leg a bit on cold mornings, and Eleanor divided her time between the store and making their house a home. In the spring, they planted a garden together, filling it with the flowers Eleanor's mother had loved, roses and sunflowers and daisies. Eleanor would work in the garden in the evenings, dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her brow, and feel a contentment she'd never known before. But it wasn't all easy. There were still moments when the old fear crept in, when Caleb was late coming home and Eleanor's mind went to dark places. There were nights when she woke up gasping from dreams of loss and had to reach out in the darkness to make sure he was still there. But each time Caleb was patient. He held her and reminded her that he was real, that he was here, that she was safe. "I'm sorry," she said one night after a particularly bad dream. "I thought I was past this." "Healing isn't linear," Caleb said, stroking her hair. "You spent 5 years building those walls. They're not going to come down overnight, but every day we'll work on it together." "Okay, okay," Eleanor whispered and let herself be held. As time passed, Eleanor found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She made friends with the other ranch wives, attended social events without feeling like she was wearing armor, even laughed at herself when she made mistakes. The woman who had refused to cry in front of anyone became someone who could share her joys and sorrows freely, secure in the knowledge that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was courage. A year and a half after their wedding, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Caleb over dinner one night simply and without fanfare, "We're going to have a baby." Caleb dropped his fork, his eyes wide. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Doc Mercer confirmed it this afternoon." Caleb was up and around the table in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "We're going to have a baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. Then he pulled back, concern replacing the joy. "Are you scared?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly I'm happy, excited, ready." "You're going to be an amazing mother," Caleb said, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "I hope so," Eleanor said. "I want to be like my mother was, patient and kind and full of joy." "You already are," Caleb assured her. "You just didn't let yourself see it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in early March of 1884, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas James, after Caleb's father and Eleanor's, and from the moment Eleanor held him, she felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it almost frightened her. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at his tiny features. "Just like his mother," Caleb said, kissing her forehead. James Hartwell, now a grandfather, was a constant presence in those early weeks, bringing supplies from the store and regaling his grandson with stories, even though Thomas was far too young to understand them. "You're a natural," he told Eleanor one afternoon as she nursed the baby. "I'm terrified I'll do something wrong," Eleanor admitted. "That's how you know you're a good parent," James said with a smile. "The ones who think they know everything are the ones to worry about." As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, Eleanor marveled at the joy he brought into their lives. He had Caleb's brown eyes and her stubborn chin, and he was curious about everything, always getting into things he shouldn't. On his second birthday, he managed to escape the house and was found in the horse barn trying to climb onto one of the mares. "He's definitely your son," Eleanor said to Caleb as they carried the protesting toddler back to the house. "My son," Caleb laughed. "He gets that stubbornness from you." Eleanor couldn't argue with that. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was less of a surprise and more of a joy. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Catherine, was born in the fall of 1887, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Thomas was boisterous and adventurous, Sarah was calm and contemplative, content to sit with her mother in the garden and examine flowers for hours. "We make beautiful children," Caleb said one evening, watching Eleanor read to both children before bed. "We do," Eleanor agreed, and felt a profound gratitude for the life they'd built together. The years passed in a blur of school events and birthday parties, scraped knees and childhood illnesses, laughter and occasional tears. Eleanor continued to help her father at the store, though less frequently as the children grew. James eventually hired a young man to help with the heavy lifting, and he and Eleanor worked side by side just as they had when she was young. "You know," James said one day as they were inventorying stock, "your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Eleanor looked at her father, at the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes, and felt her throat tighten. "I wish she could have met Caleb and the children." "I think she knows them," James said. "I think she's watching, and I think she's happy." Eleanor chose to believe that was true when Thomas was 8 and Sarah was 5. Tragedy struck the Double R Ranch. A fire broke out in one of the barns, sparked by a lantern knocked over by a spooked horse. Caleb, along with several other ranch hands, rushed to put it out. Eleanor heard about it from one of the cowboy's wives and felt the old fear roar back to life. She left the children with their grandfather and rode out to the ranch, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might be sick. When she arrived, the fire was mostly contained, but several men had been injured by falling debris and smoke inhalation. Eleanor searched frantically for Caleb and finally found him sitting on the ground, his face black with soot, coughing. "Caleb," she ran to him and dropped to her knees. "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" He looked up at her, his eyes red from the smoke. "I'm fine, Eleanor, just got a lungful of smoke, nothing serious." But Eleanor couldn't stop shaking. She wrapped her arms around him, not caring that she was getting soot all over her dress, and buried her face in his shoulder. When they said there was a fire, I thought." "Hey," Caleb said gently, pulling back to look at her. "I'm all right, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." "You can't know that," Eleanor said, and felt tears start to fall. "You can't promise that." "No," Caleb agreed, "but I can promise that I'll be as careful as I can be, and I can promise that I love you and our children more than life itself. And I can promise that no matter what happens, what we have is worth it. Isn't it?" Eleanor looked at him, at his soot-stained face and sincere eyes, and felt the fear begin to recede, because he was right. What they had, the life they'd built together, was worth any risk. "Yes," she whispered. "It's worth it." They sat there together in the aftermath of the fire, holding each other, and Eleanor realized that she had finally learned what her father had tried to tell her all those years ago. Love wasn't about protecting yourself from pain. It was about accepting that pain was part of life and choosing to love anyway. It was about vulnerability and trust, and having the courage to face each day knowing that nothing was guaranteed. It was about tears and laughter, fear and joy, all mixed together into something messy and beautiful and wholly human. That night, after they'd returned home and put the children to bed, Eleanor and Caleb sat together on the porch watching the stars come out. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Marrying someone as difficult as me," Caleb laughed. "You're not difficult. You're strong and brave and you feel things deeply. Those are all good things." "I'm still afraid sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "Of losing you, of something happening to the children, of not being good enough." "Fear is natural," Caleb said, "but you can't let it control you. You taught me that." "I taught you?" "Yes. When you faced down those men who shot your father, when you ran the store by yourself, when you agreed to marry me even though you were terrified. You showed me what real courage looks like. It's not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder and felt a deep sense of peace. "I love you, Caleb Morrison. I love you too, Eleanor Morrison, forever." The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. James Hartwell passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1892, and Eleanor grieved deeply, but without the paralyzing sorrow she'd felt when her mother died. Caleb held her through the worst of it, and Thomas and Sarah, now 11 and 8, were old enough to understand and offer their own comfort. "Grandfather lived a good life," Thomas said at the funeral. "He told me he was proud of us." "He was," Eleanor said, hugging her son. "He loved you both very much." They inherited the store, and after much discussion, Eleanor and Caleb decided to hire a manager to run it while keeping ownership. The arrangement worked well, providing them with steady income while allowing Eleanor to focus on their growing family. Because in 1893, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again at the age of 33. "I thought we were done," she said to Caleb with a mixture of surprise and delight. "Apparently not," Caleb said, grinning. "What do you think? Ready for another adventure with you? Always." Their third child, another son they named Daniel, was born in early 1894, and he completed their family. Daniel was a perfect blend of his siblings, with Thomas's adventurous spirit and Sarah's calm temperament. Watching all three children play together, Eleanor often found herself overcome with gratitude for the life she'd been given. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked one afternoon, finding her standing at the kitchen window, watching the children chase each other through the yard. "How lucky I am," Eleanor said. "How I almost threw all of this away because I was too afraid to take a chance." Caleb wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "But you didn't. You chose courage over fear, that's all that matters. You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple. Love is always worth the risk." As the children grew older, Eleanor found herself sharing her story with Sarah, who at 15 was beginning to experience her own struggles with vulnerability and trust. They sat together in the garden one afternoon, the same garden Eleanor had planted with Caleb years ago, and Sarah said, "Mama, how do you know when someone is worth trusting?" Eleanor thought about that question carefully. "You never know for certain," she said finally. "But I think you have to listen to your instincts. If someone makes you feel safe, if they see you for who you really are and still choose to stay, if they're patient with your fears and celebrate your joys, that's someone worth trusting." "How did you know Papa was that person?" "Because he told me that tears were safe with him," Eleanor said, remembering that moment in the spare room above the store. "And he meant it. He never made me feel weak for having feelings or foolish for being afraid. He just loved me exactly as I was." "I want that someday," Sarah said wistfully. "You'll find it," Eleanor assured her. "And when you do, you'll know, because you'll feel like you can finally breathe." In 1899, Thomas left home to attend university in California, studying to become an engineer. Eleanor cried when they put him on the train, but they were tears of pride mixed with sadness. "He's going to do great things," Caleb said, holding her as the train pulled away. "I know," Eleanor said. "I just wish he wasn't doing them so far away." But Thomas wrote regularly, filling his letters with stories of his classes and his new friends, and Eleanor cherished every word. Sarah, now 17, helped around the house and had begun working part-time at the store, showing the same head for business that Eleanor had at that age. And Daniel, at 5, was still young enough to need his parents for everything, which Eleanor secretly loved. The new century arrived, bringing with it changes both large and small. Automobiles began appearing on the streets of Tombstone, though Eleanor and Caleb stuck with horses for the most part. Electricity came to town, and they had their house wired, marveling at the convenience of electric lights. The store continued to thrive, adapting to the changing times by offering new products and services. In 1903, Sarah met a young man named William Foster, a teacher who had moved to Tombstone from New Mexico. Eleanor watched her daughter fall in love with a mixture of happiness and understanding. She saw the way Sarah looked at William, the way she softened around him, and she remembered feeling that way about Caleb. When William asked permission to court Sarah, Eleanor gave it gladly. "She's so young," Caleb said that night. "She's 19, Eleanor reminded him. "The same age I was when my mother died, old enough to know her own heart. You didn't marry me until you were 23. "I was a special case," Eleanor said with a smile. "I had to work through some things first. Sarah doesn't have that same fear." "Because we showed her it was safe to love," Caleb realized. Exactly. Sarah and William were married in the spring of 1904, and Eleanor cried through the entire ceremony. But this time, the tears were all joy. After the wedding, as she and Caleb danced at the reception, he said, "Remember our first dance? How could I forget?" Eleanor said. "You told me I was hiding. I was right." "Yes, you were. Thank you for seeing me, even when I didn't want to be seen." "Thank you for letting me," Caleb replied, and kissed her in front of all their guests. Thomas returned home in 1905 with a degree in engineering and plans to work on the railroad expansion through Arizona. He brought with him a young woman named Margaret, whom he introduced as his fiancée. Eleanor liked her immediately, appreciating her intelligence and her obvious devotion to Thomas. They were married that fall, and Eleanor found herself with 2 married children and feeling older than her 45 years. "We're going to be grandparents soon," Caleb predicted. "Don't rush it," Eleanor said, though secretly she was looking forward to it. Sure enough, in 1906, Sarah gave birth to a daughter named Eleanor Catherine, and Eleanor held her namesake with tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect," she whispered. "Just like her grandmother," Sarah said, smiling tiredly from the bed. That same year, Margaret gave birth to a son, and Thomas wrote to say they'd named him Caleb James. Eleanor and Caleb traveled to see their grandson, and Eleanor marveled at how life had come full circle. She who had once been so afraid of losing people now had a family that extended in all directions, each person a testament to the love she'd been brave enough to accept. Daniel, now 12, was the only child still at home, and he took his role as the baby of the family seriously. He was clever and funny and showed an early aptitude for business that reminded Eleanor of herself. "He's going to run that store someday," Caleb said. "If he wants to," Eleanor corrected, "but I think you might be right." The years passed in a gentle rhythm of births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. More grandchildren arrived, and Eleanor and Caleb's house became a gathering place for the extended family. They added onto the original structure, building more bedrooms and a larger dining room to accommodate everyone. Sunday dinners became a tradition, with the table groaning under the weight of food and the house ringing with laughter and conversation. In 1910, Caleb's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing down, a weariness that rest didn't cure. Doc Mercer, now an old man himself, examined him thoroughly and told Eleanor privately that Caleb's heart was giving out. "How long?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "Could be months, could be years. There's no way to know for certain." Eleanor nodded once, thanked him, and went home to tell Caleb what the doctor had said. They sat together in the garden, surrounded by the flowers they'd planted together nearly 30 years ago, and Caleb took her hand. "I'm not afraid," he said. I've had a good life, a great life, because of you. Don't, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. Don't talk like you're already gone. I'm not going anywhere yet, Caleb assured her. But when I do, whenever that is, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't shut down again. Don't build those walls back up. You have children and grandchildren who need you, and you have yourself. Promise me you'll keep living, keep feeling, keep letting people in. Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had taught her how to be vulnerable, how to love without reservation, how to face her fears, and she nodded. I promise. Caleb lived for another 5 years. They were good years, full of family gatherings and quiet moments together, laughter and tears and everything in between. He got to see Daniel graduate from school and begin working at the store. He got to hold his youngest grandchild, Sarah's 3rd child. He got to celebrate his and Eleanor's 30th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them. In the fall of 1915, Caleb took a turn for the worse. Eleanor nursed him at home, refusing to let him die anywhere but in their bed, surrounded by the life they'd built together. The children came, one by one, to say goodbye. Caleb spoke to each of them, offering advice and love and blessing, and Eleanor sat beside him through it all, holding his hand. On a cool October evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Caleb looked at Eleanor and smiled. It's been a good life, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The best, Eleanor agreed, tears streaming down her face. Don't be sad for too long. Remember your promise. I remember. I love you, Eleanor Morrison. From that first moment in the store to right now, you've been the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you too, Eleanor said. So much, forever. Caleb's eyes drifted closed and his breathing slowed. Eleanor held his hand and talked to him, telling him about their life together, about their children and grandchildren, about the garden and the store and the home they'd made. She talked until his breathing stopped, until she felt his hand go limp in hers, and then she laid her head on his chest and wept. She cried for the man she'd lost, for the years they wouldn't have, for the grandchildren he wouldn't see grow up. She cried for herself, for the loneliness that stretched ahead of her. But even in her grief, she felt a profound gratitude, because Caleb had been right. Their life together had been worth every risk, every moment of fear, every tear. He had taught her how to live fully, how to love without reservation, and that was a gift she would carry for the rest of her days. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Caleb had been respected in the community, known for his fairness and kindness and integrity. Eleanor stood beside his grave and listened as the preacher spoke about a life well lived, and she felt the truth of those words in her bones. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor grieved deeply but not destructively. She cried often, but she also laughed when her grandchildren told her stories. She felt the pain of loss, but she also felt the comfort of family. She honored her promise to Caleb and kept living, kept feeling, kept letting people in. Daniel moved back home to keep her company, and Eleanor was grateful for his presence. He ran the store with the same efficiency she had once shown, and in the evenings they would sit together and talk about their days. Tell me about Papa, Daniel would say, and Eleanor would share stories of Caleb, keeping his memory alive. Sarah and Thomas visited often with their families, and the house remained full of life and laughter. Eleanor became the matriarch of the family, the one everyone turned to for advice and comfort. She passed on the lessons Caleb had taught her. Be vulnerable, face your fears, love without reservation. And she told them all about the cowboy who had looked at a scared, closed-off woman and said that tears were safe with him. In 1925, on what would have been their 40th wedding anniversary, Eleanor stood in the garden and spoke to Caleb as if he were standing beside her. I kept my promise, she said. I kept living. I kept loving. I let people in, and I've been happy even without you. But I miss you every single day. A breeze ruffled her hair, and Eleanor chose to believe it was Caleb's way of saying he heard her. She lived for another 10 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren born, long enough to celebrate her 70th birthday surrounded by 3 generations of family. Long enough to know that the love she and Caleb had built had spread out like ripples in a pond, touching everyone around them. When Eleanor died peacefully in her sleep in 1935, at the age of 75, her children found a letter she'd written to be read after her death. In it, she told them about the woman she'd been before she met Caleb, about the fear that had ruled her life, about the walls she'd built to protect herself. And she told them about the cowboy who had seen through those walls, who had offered her safety and love and a chance at real happiness. I could have let fear win, the letter concluded. I could have spent my life alone and told myself I was strong, but your father taught me that real strength isn't about protecting yourself from pain. It's about opening yourself up to love, even knowing that love might hurt you. It's about choosing courage over fear, connection over isolation, vulnerability over walls. I'm so grateful I made that choice. I'm so grateful he never gave up on me. And I hope that each of you will make the same choice in your own lives. Don't hide from love because you're afraid of losing it. Embrace it, cherish it, let it change you. Because in the end, love is all that matters. It's what we leave behind, and it's what keeps us alive long after we're gone. The letter was read at her funeral, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Eleanor was buried next to Caleb, their headstones side by side, and their family made sure that the garden at the ranch was always tended, always full of the flowers Eleanor had loved. Years later, their great-great-grandchildren would hear the story of Eleanor and Caleb, the woman who refused to cry and the cowboy who taught her that tears were safe with him. They would hear about courage and vulnerability, fear and love, and they would carry those lessons forward into their own lives, because that's what love does. It doesn't end when we die. It lives on in the people we touch, the lives we change, the legacy we leave behind. And somewhere in whatever comes after, Eleanor and Caleb were together again, dancing under endless stars, their love as strong and true as it had always been. Because some things, the best things, really do last forever.